Justin, thank you for being here with me today, as always. Talk to me about this voting rights case that's being litigated before the Supreme Court.
This voting rights case is a very big deal because it is looking at a major part of the Voting Rights Act and trying to decide whether it should still be around.
And what part of the Voting Rights Act is that?
So this case is about Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, and that's really the thing that makes states draw congressional districts that are majority-minority. That's sort of been part of our law for decades and decades, and that's what's at question in this case.
So this is different. Is this like different than gerrymandering or anything like that?
You know, this is really actually what was the remedy for gerrymandering. So when a state would gerrymander on racial grounds, this Voting Rights Act provision would try to correct that by giving minority groups more of a voice in Congress.
And why, what specific question is the Supreme Court looking to answer in this case?
The Supreme Court is looking to answer whether it is okay in this day and age, in 2025, to create majority-minority districts anymore. The question is whether that's unfair to non-minority voters in those states.
And what stood out to you so far in, researching on this case, listening to some of the oral arguments, what stood out to you?
What stood out to me from the oral arguments is that the justices do seem inclined to somewhat soften the Voting Rights Act. I suspect it will be much harder in the future for people to challenge these state maps in court.
Why is that?
If the court does what we think it may do, it's probably going to require a lot higher of a standard of proof for someone to challenge a voting map, a districting map. And they're going to make it much harder to get into court, basically.
What could this mean, for representation? I'll just start out. Here in East Texas, what could this mean for voters?
In East Texas, we probably won't experience much of a change in our daily life. But what could happen is that around the country, some of the districts that have been drawn based on the previous understanding of the law may get redrawn. We may see a bunch of new maps in a bunch of new states, and we may see the balance of power in Congress shift a little bit because of this decision.
Shift towards who?
In the current day and age, if the court strikes down or softens the Voting Rights Act, I think you'll see an advantage to the Republicans in terms of gaining some new districts.
What's been the argument for the use of majority-minority districts?
The argument for majority-minority districts was that it was helping correct the remedy of racial gerrymandering back in the day. It was sort of a corrective action since the mid-1960s to help give minority groups more congressional representation where they were intentionally kept from congressional representation back in the day.
So you sort of alluded to this earlier, but what are you personally expecting the Supreme Court to do here?
What I expect the Supreme Court to do, just based on the oral arguments, is that they won't strike down this provision in the Voting Rights Act. Instead, they'll find sort of a middle ground, which is to say, look, we need to also make sure we're respecting the state's desire when they draw a map to account for things like politics. Part of their job is to make these partisan districts. And I think the court is going to say that they want to respect the state's ability to partisan gerrymander a little bit.
And just to be clear, this would impact Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act.
That's right.
Let's say the Supreme Court even finds that middle ground. Would the entirety of the Voting Rights Act be declared unconstitutional, or just one specific part, most likely?
The Supreme Court may well keep Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. They probably won't strike it down. They have struck down parts of it before, or essentially narrowed parts of it so much that they don't really apply anymore.
You say they have kind of changed the Voting Rights Act. How so?
In the past, the Supreme Court basically did away with the pre-clearance requirement for some of the states, particularly in the South. Meaning, if a state made a change in voting laws or maps, they had to go get approval from the federal government. They essentially did away with that many years ago.
If say the Supreme Court is going to do what you expect them to do, take that middle ground, how significant of a ruling do you feel that could be?
If the Supreme Court does what I think it will do, it will be a major political ruling, because I suspect you'll see maps, voting maps, and congressional district maps redrawn across the country, particularly in southern states.
Now, we have also seen other, redistricting cases in the past, Chauvin Reno is one that comes to my mind immediately. I believe that was relating to North Carolina. But this is a bit different, it seems like, from just redistricting. This handles another topic. Would that be correct in saying?
Yeah, what's so interesting about this case is the court is for the first time really saying that they are willing to think or willing to entertain the idea that the Voting Rights Act has met its sort of natural end or is reaching its conclusion, and that it should be a little bit stricter of a standard now if you're going to tell certain states to do things a certain way.
Could you see them looking at any other laws through that sort of lens, depending on what they rule with this case?
Yeah, the Supreme Court seems to be on a trend now of finding ways to make things race neutral. So we saw that with college admissions. We're seeing that getting raised again in this case. I suspect we'll see it much more in the near future.
How do we see that with college admissions?
With college admissions, the court basically said that you can't consider race as a factor in the admissions process. And so they're looking for a colorblind constitution, as one of them has put it. And that seems to be the thread that's going through a lot of these cases right now.
Is there anything I didn't ask you would like to add?
The swing vote on this decision will probably be Justice Kavanaugh. And in the oral arguments, he seemed very inclined to soften the Voting Rights Act or make it harder to challenge maps under the Voting Rights Act.